All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're going way back to ancient China to tackle some, well, pretty complex stuff and honestly kind of a fascinating intellectual puzzle.
Yeah, we're talking about the Mohist canons.
The Mohist Canons, exactly. And, sometimes when we think about ancient philosophy, we tend to get stuck on just the ethics or maybe some mystical ideas.
Right, like it's all about virtue or some vague spiritual pronouncements.
Yeah, but these Mohist Canons, well, they're different.
They really are. I mean, when you look at them closely, and we're relying here on some great scholarship, especially from the Stanford Encyclopedia of
Yeah,
Philosophy.
that's our main source for this deep dive.
Right, what you find is this incredibly sophisticated approach to topics that, well, they're still the bread and butter of philosophy today, like
Oh.
language, logic, how we know things, epistemology. Big stuff.
And it's all happening during a period of, well, let's just say intense upheaval in China.
The Warring States period, from 479 to 221 BC.
Right. So you've got all this social and political chaos, and in the midst of it all, this philosophical school emerges.
The Mohists, a really influential movement.
And within that, you have these later Mohists or neo-Mohists.
They're the ones who give us these canons.
Right. And they're hanging out, intellectually speaking, with another group called the School of Names.
Both of them were totally fascinated by language, by how we argue, by how we use words to make sense of the world.
Yeah, they were wrestling with some pretty heady stuff. I mean, think about those classic philosophical paradoxes like the problem of hard and white.
Or the puzzle of same and different.
Exactly. But here's the thing that I think will really grab our listeners, especially if they're coming at this from, say, a Western philosophical background. The scope of these Mohist canons is mind-blowing.
It really is. It's not just ethics, although they definitely had a lot to say about that.
Right, they do, but, I mean, they delve into what we now call the philosophy of language, like how does meaning actually work?
And epistemology, the nature of knowledge itself.
And get this, they even touch on areas we'd consider science now, like they think about cause and effect, about space and time, even about those fundamental questions of existence.
Ontology.
Ontology, exactly. And on top of all that, you have these forays into geometry, mechanics, optics. They even talk about economics. And it's not just random musings. It's all very carefully reasoned argumentation.
So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack some of these core philosophical ideas from the Mohist canons.
We'll tackle ethics, language, knowledge, and their whole approach to disputation.
And honestly, I think our listeners will be surprised by just how deep and how relevant this stuff still is today.
So let's start with ethics. A good place to begin, right? The Mohists, they were really interested in figuring out how we decide what's right and what's wrong.
Right, like what are the foundations for making those ethical judgments?
Exactly. Now, initially, they thought these judgments were rooted in the social norms we learn.
The norms we get from, looking up to our superiors in society, our elders, our leaders, right? Like conforming to the standards that were already in place.
And they had this idea of three models to explain where these norms came from.
The first one was the precedent of wise leaders from the past. Like, what did the sages do? What can we learn from their actions?
Right. And then you have the second model, which is perceptual experience. What do we see in the world around us? How do people actually behave?
And finally, and I think this is really crucial for understanding their ethics, they looked at whether something brings benefit to society as a whole.
So it's got a mix of tradition, observation, and this idea of social utility. Right?
Exactly. Those three models working together to tell us what's right and wrong. But here's where it gets interesting, especially if you're thinking about the development of ethical theory.
Yeah. What happens with those later Mohists?
Well, they seem to shift away from relying so heavily on heaven or Tian as the ultimate source of those ethical norms.
Right. In earlier Mohism, there's this idea that heaven acts to promote universal benefit. So doing the right thing means aligning yourself with heaven's will.
But those later texts, they kind of go quiet on heaven's intention.
Which, I mean, that's a big deal for a philosopher, right?
Yeah.
It almost feels like this turning point in ancient ethical thought. Maybe it's a move towards a more human-centered morality.
Possibly. Or at least, a more pragmatic way of figuring out right and wrong.
Right. Like instead of looking to some cosmic order, maybe they're starting to say, hey, let's focus on the actual observable consequences of our actions.
It opens up that possibility for sure. It's like they're moving towards a kind of consequentialism where what matters most is the outcome, the results.
Right. Like, did it lead to more good or more harm?
Exactly. But, and this is where it gets tricky, it's not a simple, straightforward consequentialism. There are hints of something else going on, too.
Like what?
Well, they also seem to have this idea that the world itself, reality, it kind of dictates certain fundamental similarities between things.
Okay, so that's more of a realist view, right? There's an
Yeah.
objective structure to reality. It's not all just relative.
Right. So maybe it's this interplay between, on the one hand, this objective basis of similarity, and on the other hand, this more practical focus on the consequences of actions.
So to understand all this, I think we need to take a closer look at the texts themselves.
Right. We need to grapple with the Mobion. That's the heart of their work on dialectics.
And as part of this larger book called the Mosey, right?
Exactly. And this is where it gets a little bit challenging, especially for philosophers who are used to, say, the systematic treatises of Western philosophy.
Right, like our arguments laid out nice and neat with all the premises and conclusions spelled out.
Well, the Mobion is not like that at all. It's a collection of 6 texts, and they're incredibly terse, sometimes to the point of being, well, a little frustrating.
So we have these 2 books of Jing, which are these very short, kind of axiomatic sounding canons.
Right. And then you have the 2 books of Jing Shush, which are supposed to be explanations of those canons.
Okay, so that makes sense.
And then, just to make things even more interesting, you have the Dakyu, the Greater Selection, and the Singokyu, the Lesser Selection.
And those
They're
are
collections of, I don't know, fragments, really, that cover all sorts of topics like ethics, semantics, even logic.
so for a philosopher, it's like trying to piece together a puzzle.
It really is. The terminology isn't always consistent. The organization is all over the place. It's not like those beautifully structured deductive systems you see in some Western philosophy.
Right. No clear-cut definitions, no linear progression of arguments. It's more like a series of, I don't know, brilliant but sometimes disconnected insights.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that means that any interpretation of what those later Mohists really thought, especially about ethics, is going to be, well, somewhat conjectural.
Like we're making educated guesses based on the fragments we have.
Exactly. But having said all that, the general consensus among scholars is that they were probably some kind of indirect consequentialists.
So that means they still cared about the overall benefit, the li. But they didn't think you had to calculate the consequences of every single action.
Right. They probably thought the best way to achieve that benefit was to follow certain general norms, even if those norms didn't always lead to the best outcome in every specific situation.
So it's like a way of balancing the pursuit of good consequences with the need for some stable, reliable guidelines for action.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. But like I said, the texts are fragmentary, so it's possible there were other elements in their thinking too.
Like what?
Well, remember how they emphasized those established social norms in their earlier writings?
Right.
So maybe there was also a bit of deontology mixed in, a focus on duties, on rules themselves, not just the consequences.
Okay, so it might have been a more complex ethical system than just straightforward consequentialism.
It's definitely possible, especially because the Greater Selection, where a lot of their ethical reflections are found, has suffered some pretty significant textual damage over the centuries, so it's hard to say for sure.
Right. But even with these fragments, we do see them getting more precise about their key ethical concepts.
Oh, yeah. Like, they give us clearer definitions of morality, yi, benefit, benevolence, ren, and care.
Right. They're not just assuming everyone knows what these terms mean, they're actually trying to spell it out.
Yeah. And the way they define benevolence is really interesting. They say it's about caring about individuals, and care seems to involve, like, a genuine concern for the well-being of those individuals for their own sake.
And that ties into their famous idea of inclusive care, Janai,
Right.
that impartial moral concern for everyone.
Exactly. It's like this fundamental moral principle for them. And what's really interesting from a philosophical perspective is that those later texts, they don't really give us new arguments for why we should have this inclusive care.
They kind of treat it as a given, like it's just the starting point.
Yeah, and they spend more time trying to answer objections to it, like, logical or practical challenges to the idea of inclusive care.
So they're saying, look, we get it. This idea might seem a little strange, but here's why it actually makes sense.
Exactly. And one clarification they make is really important for understanding what they mean by inclusive care. They say, inclusive care is equal. Care for each one is equal.
So we should have the same degree of moral concern for every single person.
Right. But, and this is crucial, they don't think that means we have the same obligations to everyone.
Like, I don't have the same duty to a random stranger as I do to my own child.
Exactly. They're saying our specific duties are shaped by our relationships with others.
Okay, so they're not advocating for some kind of radical egalitarianism where everyone gets treated exactly the same, regardless of their connection to us.
Right. They're trying to find a balance between this fundamental moral concern for all and the specific duties that arise from our different roles in society.
So let's talk about some of those key ethical innovations that we see in those later Mohist texts.
All right, sounds good. Where do you want to start?
Well, first, we've already talked about how they move away from relying on heaven as the ultimate source of ethics.
Right, that's a big one.
Second, they redefine benefit and harm in terms of individual happiness and dislike.
Yeah, which is a shift from those earlier Mohists who focused more on material goods, like food and shelter.
Right. Then third, you have their system of relation ranking, which tells us how our obligations are structured based on our connections to others.
And finally, they introduce this idea of weighing benefit and harm when we're making decisions.
So lots to unpack here. Let's dive into that relation ranking idea.
All right, so the basic idea is this. Even though we should have this fundamental moral regard for everyone, it's morally right to prioritize benefiting those who are closer to us.
Like our family, our friends, our rulers.
Exactly. And they saw this as fitting in with the overall social Tao, the way things are supposed to be.
So on the surface, this might sound a lot like Confucianism, right? With its emphasis on role-based duties, like I have a special duty to my parents that I don't have to strangers.
Right. There are definitely some similarities, but the justification seems different.
The Confucians kind of start with those inherent duties, right? Like it's just part of the natural order that we have these specific obligations to those in our immediate circles.
But the Mohists, they seem to derive those duties from this principle of universal benefit. It's like they're saying, look, if everyone focuses on taking care of their own families and communities, it actually leads to greater overall well-being for everyone in the long run.
So it's a more, I don't know, strategic or calculated approach to those relational duties.
I think that's a fair way to put it. They have this general ethne, this model of promoting overall well-being, and they apply it not by strictly deducing from first principles, but by looking at existing social practices and seeing what works.
So more of an inductive approach to ethics based on observing patterns.
Exactly. But, and this is where things get philosophically interesting, how do you reconcile that with the whole idea of inclusive care?
Right. If I'm supposed to care equally for everyone, why should I give special treatment to those close to me?
Well, the Mohists might say that care, in that context, when we're talking about inclusive care, it refers more to a kind of basic moral recognition.
Like acknowledging the inherent worth of every individual.
Right. It's not necessarily about having the same level of emotional attachment to everyone, or even the same set of specific duties.
Okay, so you can still have these special virtues, like filial piety towards your parents, or compassion, see, for your children, without violating that principle of universal moral consideration.
Yeah, exactly. It's like those virtues fit within this broader framework of recognizing the moral worth of all people. But there's another interesting piece to this puzzle.
Which is?
Well, there's this fragment about weighing that's relevant to this whole discussion of equal care.
And it's, well, a little controversial, right?
Yeah, a bit. It seems to suggest that in some extreme situations, it might be okay to sacrifice one life to benefit the world.
But there's a catch, right?
There is. The fragment makes a distinction between sacrificing someone else and sacrificing yourself.
So, it might be permissible to let one person die to save many others, but you're not allowed to do that to yourself.
It's really fascinating, and it suggests that they weren't just straightforward utilitarians who would simply calculate the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Right. They had some moral boundaries, especially when it came to one's own life.
Exactly. And this asymmetry, the way they treat self-sacrifice differently, it points towards a more nuanced ethical system than just simple act consequentialism.
So let's talk about that concept of weighing, Quan, in a bit more detail. It seems like a key part of their practical reasoning.
Oh, it definitely is. They saw it as this process of judging, comparing greater benefit and lesser harm when you're faced with some tough choices.
Like when your values are in conflict, or when there's no obvious right answer, no action that's going to lead to pure benefit.
Right. And they actually made a distinction between weighing of ends, like the goals you're trying to achieve, and weighing of means, like how you're going to go about achieving those goals.
So deciding what's the most important thing to pursue versus figuring out the best way to get there.
Yeah, exactly. And they have this really vivid example to illustrate this. It's about a captured traveler who's forced to choose between losing a finger, an arm, or his life.
Ouch.
Right. So clearly, losing any body part is a bad thing, it's a harm. But in that specific situation, losing a finger is the lesser harm.
And therefore, it's the beneficial choice, even though it still involves a loss.
Exactly. It's a really powerful way of showing how context matters in ethical decision making.
And how this idea of weighing allows for some flexibility, some nuance within their broader ethical framework.
Right. So to sum it up, I think it's fair to say that those later Mohists lean towards a kind of indirect consequentialism, where you follow general norms that usually lead to good outcomes. But they also had this element of act consequentialism built in, with this concept of weighing benefit and harm in specific situations.
Okay, so their ethics were pretty complex and sophisticated.
Yeah, they were. And it gets even more interesting when we start looking at their philosophy of language.
All right, let's dive into that.
So, one of their really fundamental ideas was that all words at their core function as names. Ming.
Like proper names.
No, not just those. They didn't really make those sharp distinctions between different parts of speech that we see in, say, Western grammar.
Like nouns, verbs, adjectives, all that.
Right. For them, it was all about names. But they did categorize these names based on, like, how broadly they applied.
So you have the all-reaching names, like the term thing, woo, which obviously applies to pretty much everything.
Right. It's super general. Then you have the kind names, low E, like horse, which applies to all horses, but not to, say, cows or dogs.
And finally, you have the personal names, like Jack,
Right.
which refers to a specific individual.
Right. And for their overall theory of meaning, those kind names were especially important.
Because that's how we categorize things in the world.
Sure.
We group them together based on shared characteristics.
Exactly. And they had this term, she, which is really crucial here. It's a kind of catch-all term for stuff, things, objects, even reality itself.
It's like the basic building blocks of existence.
Yeah. And they had this really interesting view of properties.
Properties like being red or being round.
Right, exactly. They didn't think of those properties as separate entities, like floating around out there somewhere. They saw them as inherent parts of the she.
So like redness isn't something that's added onto a ball. It's just part of what it means for that ball to be red.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And when they thought about what made something a horse, they focused on observable similarities in the she.
Similarities in like their physical characteristics, their behavior, that kind of thing.
Right. They talked about shape and look, xingmao, residence and migration, xiyun, a mountain number, liangshu.
So like if it looks like a horse, walks like a horse, and hangs out with other horses, it's probably a horse.
Yeah, something like that. And they had this idea of a F, a model or exemplar of a particular kind.
So like the perfect horse, the ideal horse that all other horses are measured against.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And if a particular she is similar enough to that hag, especially in its observable characteristics, its Mao, then it gets that name.
It's a horse.
Right. And this suggests that for them, those similarity relations weren't just arbitrary. Like, we didn't just randomly decide to call certain things horses. There's something in the world itself, in those she, that makes them horses.
Okay, so there's a kind of objective basis for our categories, for our language.
Exactly. Now, they also had some really interesting ideas about different types of speech acts, different ways we can use names. They called this calling way.
Okay, so like what are the different ways we can call something?
Well, one type is designating, which seems to be about, like, linking names together, like saying dogs or hounds.
Okay, so you're kind of defining one name in terms of another.
Yeah, something like that. Then you
Right.
have applying G, which is a little more tricky.
Like how do they explain that?
Their example is scolding a dog, which might be about using, like, evaluative terms, or maybe it's about predication.
So like saying bad dog.
Yeah, possibly. And then the third type is presenting, JAME, which is just using a name to refer to something, to talk about it.
Like if I say the dog is barking, I'm presenting a dog.
Exactly. And that idea of presenting is really fascinating because it's different from how we often think about reference today.
How so?
Well, we tend to think of reference as, like, directly picking out an object in the world. Like when I say that dog, I'm pointing to a specific dog and saying that one right there.
Right.
But for the Mohists, presenting seems to be more about, like, emulating or providing a model. It's like a name shows you what the speaker means, almost like a picture.
So it's not just about pointing, it's about invoking a shared understanding of what a dog is, what kind of thing it is.
Right. And that leads us to their theory of communication. They thought that when we use names, especially those kind names, we're appealing to these shared practices for distinguishing similar she.
Like, we've all learned to recognize horses based on those similarities we talked about before.
Exactly. So words represent by showing what's the same, tongue, and that sameness is based on those collectively learned kind distinctions, the lay.
Okay, so language isn't just about individual words and their meanings. It's also about how we use those words together, how we connect them to the world through our shared practices.
Right. And language helps us to gain knowledge, see, because it tells us what something is like, Ruo. It's like using the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar.
Like if I say, this animal is like a horse, but bigger and with stripes, you can start to picture a zebra, even if you've never seen one before.
Exactly. It's like using a measuring tool.
Mhm.
And this shared understanding, that's what allows us to connect thoughts, Tonye, to communicate with each other.
Okay, so they have a very practical, grounded view of language, but it's not just about like pointing and naming things. It's also about expressing our thoughts, our intentions.
Right. And they use this term, yi, for thought or intention. But here's where it gets really interesting for a philosopher. They didn't think of mental ideas as being the primary explanation for how words work.
So it's not like I have an idea of a horse in my mind, and then I use the word horse to express that idea.
Right. They thought it was the other way around. The way we use words based on those shared similarity judgments and practices, that's what explains how we express our thoughts.
Okay, so yi is more like the point of
Yeah.
what we're saying, the speaker's intention, not just the meaning of individual words.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And they saw trustworthiness as being about the alignment between what a speaker says, their yan, and their underlying yi.
So, like, if you say you're going to do something, but you have no intention of actually doing it, then you're not being trustworthy.
Exactly. So to sum up their philosophy of language, it's all about those associations between names and kinds of similar she. Communication works because we have the shared understanding of those kinds. And the link between language and the world, it's not through mental ideas or abstract essences, it's through those perceived similarities and our communal practices of using names.
It's a very naturalistic, grounded theory,
Hmm.
very different from some of those more mentalistic theories of language you see in Western philosophy.
Right, but it does raise some pretty big questions.
Like what?
Well, how do we determine those fundamental kinds in the first place? What makes a particular distinction, like between horses and cows, the correct one? And what justifies us all agreeing on those categories?
Well, those are some pretty deep epistemological issues.
Exactly. And that takes us into the next part of our deep dive, their theory of knowledge.
All right, let's talk about how the Mohists thought about knowing.
Well, like a lot of ancient thinkers, they were really focused on how we correctly distinguish she, this, from fi, not this.
And this is all about how we use language, right?
Exactly. They wanted to know how we can be sure that we're applying terms accurately, that we're grouping things together correctly.
And they weren't so concerned with, like, abstract notions of justification or the truth of beliefs that you might see in some later Western philosophy.
Right. They were more focused on that practical ability to use language effectively in the world.
Okay, so where do they lay out their theory of knowledge?
The core of it is found in those canons I mentioned before, A36 and A80.
Right, but you said the relationship between those sections isn't totally clear.
Yeah, it's a bit messy, but they give us some really valuable insights into how they thought about knowing. So first, they introduce this concept of the knowing, which is this basic capacity for conscious awareness and for all sorts of mental functions.
Like, it's what allows us to think, to feel, to experience the world.
Yeah, exactly. And they say it's active when we're alive and awake, which kind of makes sense. And this capacity is the foundation for everything else. It's the source of our knowledge, but also the source of our desires and aversions.
So, like, if I see a piece of cake and I want to eat it, that desire is coming from the knowing,
Right. And they talk about different functions of the knowing, like deliberation.
which is...
It's this mental process of seeking to distinguish she from fi or benefit from harm.
So, like, when you're trying to decide what to do, you're deliberating.
Right. And they don't describe it as some kind of formal logical deduction, like a syllogism. It's more like this mental exploration, the scanning of your options.
It's okay, so you're trying to figure out what's the best course of action, what's going to lead to the most benefit and the least harm.
Exactly. And then they talk about another function, which is knowing, or recognition.
And how do they explain that?
They say it's like contacting things. Like when you see something clearly, you're making contact with it.
Okay, so it's a very perceptual way of thinking about knowing.
Right. And they define this kind of knowing as this practical ability, Ning, to describe Mao something you've encountered.
So, like, if I see a dog and I can say, that's a dog, then I know what a dog is.
Right. And notice it's not about some internal mental state like believing a proposition.
It's about having the know-how to apply the right term to the right thing.
Exactly. It's very practical, very action-oriented, but, and this is important, they didn't restrict knowing to just this direct perceptual experience.
So there are other ways to know things.
Oh, yeah. They also thought you could gain knowledge from reports, from what other people tell you.
So they recognize the importance of testimony, of learning from others.
Exactly. And that really emphasizes the social dimension of knowledge, right? It's not just about what I can figure out on my own, it's also about what I can learn from other people.
Right. And then they talk about this other kind of knowledge, which is more discursive, more about understanding how things fit together.
Yeah, they associate that with the ability to sort things into kinds.
Like, if I understand what a mammal is, and I know that dogs are mammals, then I have a deeper understanding of dogs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they use this analogy of vision again. It's like moving from blurry vision to clear sight.
So the more you understand, the clearer things become.
Right. And they call this a systematic capacity to recognize and classify Ling.
So it's like a kind of theoretical knowledge, right? It's not just about being able to name things. It's about understanding the underlying structure of reality.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. But again, it's not about deductive systems or propositions. It's still grounded in those classifications, in those kinds.
Okay, so knowledge for them is ultimately about the ability to sort things correctly and to apply names accurately.
Right. And they gave us a pretty clear account of where that knowledge comes from.
The sources of knowledge.
Exactly. And they list three: sensory experience, information from others, and reasoning.
So basically what I see, what I hear, what I figure out on my own.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that they seem to give equal weight to all three.
So like testimony, what other people tell me, is just as valid a source of knowledge as my own direct experience.
Right. Which, makes sense if you think about how much we rely on other people for information.
Yeah, we're not just isolated individuals figuring everything out on our own.
Yeah.
We're part of a community of knowers.
Exactly. And they also list 4 objects of knowledge. Names, Ming, the stuff those names refer to, Shi, the matching or fit between the name and the thing, hey, and acting, Wei, which is intentional conduct.
So it's not just about knowing facts, it's also about knowing how to act in the world.
Right. They had this very integrated view of knowledge and action.
And they even talk about sources of doubt.
Yeah, they list 4: accidental circumstances, inconclusive evidence, causal overdetermination, and the fact that things change over time.
So, like, sometimes things happen by chance, sometimes we don't have enough information, sometimes multiple causes are at work, and sometimes things just don't stay the same.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that they present these as external challenges to knowledge, not problems with our own minds.
So it's not like they're skeptical about our ability to know things in principle.
Right. They're more concerned with those practical obstacles that can get in the way of accurate knowing.
Okay, so we've covered ethics, language, and knowledge. What's next?
Well, all of those topics lead us into their views on disputation or bayan.
Which is?
It's their whole approach to argumentation, to reasoning, to figuring out what's true.